Welcome everybody to this 60-minute webinar on the inclusion imperative. My name is Andy Brough. I'm going to be your moderator for today's program. It's great to have you with us. Roosevelt Thomas, who's widely regarded as one of the fathers of diversity, said that diversity is about all the ways in which we are similar and all the ways in which we differ. And so inclusion then would be leveraging that diversity in the workplace to achieve full performance and optimum participation. The business case for diversity has been well made, and in today's session we want to move beyond that to explore the intersection between diversity, global talent, mobility in relation to inclusion. In the post-COVID world of 2020, we know that as more people are working remotely, discussion has moved from a focus on purely cultural, cross-cultural training to international focus on diversity and inclusion at an organizational level. So some of the questions we want to think about is, where does the agenda start and end? Is this the responsibility solely of an organization's D&I department? Where does leadership fit in? And what of the future generation of talent coming through? Well, joining me to discuss this important question today, it's a great pleasure to welcome a truly global panel, starting with Professor Yih-Teen Lee, who is a professor at IESE in Barcelona. He's currently talking to us from his home in Taiwan. We also have Beth Peralta, who is the head of diversity and inclusion at Teradata, talking to us from San Diego. And it's a great pleasure also for me to welcome my colleague, Crosby, who's the CEO of TMA World and country Navigator. We are hoping to be joined by Zanaib Naby, who's the head of global mobility for Prosus, and we'll look out for her in just a moment. We have four broad themes that we want to explore. Firstly, the intersection points between diversity, mobility, and talent as they relate to inclusion. Secondly, practical steps that we might take to execute on that. Thirdly, the question of leadership and the role that leadership would play in underpinning all of this. And then finally, and very importantly, where does cultural intelligence fit in? How do we develop that? And how do we measure the cultural quotient? If you've just joined us, welcome. Welcome to the show. We want to invite you to participate with us by typing questions into the chat, and we'll take as many of those as we can throughout the program. So let's just have a look at a couple of the points in this slide presentation. We will also make a recording of the session available to you. So in the next slide, what you'll see here is the business case for diversity has been made. That's very clear, so we don't need to revisit that today. The second thing that I think is really important in the next slide is this idea that as we think about diversity, we also need to recognize that diversity is a choice. Diversity is a reality, but inclusion is a choice. And how do we then embrace all employees and enable them to make meaningful contributions? I do want to ask the panel about this sentiment survey that was done by McKinsey, where there does seem to be some gap between sentiments around diversity versus inclusion. So we'll come back to that. In terms of terms and definitions, very simply, in the next slide there, we look at this idea that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is allowing everyone to dance, and cultural intelligence is knowing how to join in. So again, welcome to all of you, welcome to the panel, and we're going to go straight into it. Let me come straight to you, Beth, first of all, by asking you just to comment on the relationship between diversity and inclusion. It does seem to mean different things in different parts of the world. What does it mean in the context where you live and work, Beth?
Absolutely. Thanks, Andy. Yeah, oftentimes, especially in the US, diversity is thought of as someone's, race or ethnicity, and it obviously goes far beyond that. In my organization, we're really focused on educating our colleagues around the world to think about the many different dimensions of diversity beyond the obvious, and really focusing on the individual value that every colleague brings to the organization, so that we can truly have a sense of belonging in our organization. Yih-Teen,
from your point of view, how would you see the face of diversity changing in terms of talent and mobility from the work that you're doing?
Okay, so maybe I would take this point a little bit from your comment earlier, Andy. So basically, when you said that diversity is a reality and inclusion is a choice, I think that maybe my approach to diversity is that it's even if it is a reality, but it is still a reality that is under some choices as well. That means that I think that as companies, as managers, as human beings, we still have something that we need to see the evolution of how diversity can evolve in the world, in the society in general, or in our company. So definitely we are seeing more migrants, more immigration, but somehow this trend might be changing, shifting. But I think that to a large extent, it is still in our hand, in business leaders, managers, and organizations to think more carefully about what kind of company they want to build, and then still making sure that they can have this kind of diversity present. But at the same time, then working on the second step, as you said, how to leverage those talent that we have in the organization so that those talent can be properly leveraged. So it's basically I guess that agree with you that we made the case, but somehow we cannot forget about diversity completely. Basically, it's like an ongoing battle that we need to somehow continuously think very carefully. But I would say that it is also not to say that we want to enhance diversity at all costs. It's not the case, but let's very carefully, consciously think about what kind of community what we want to build, and then work this constantly together, hand in hand with our effort with inclusion.
Thanks, Yih-Teen. Zanaib, thank you for joining us. I see that you might still be on mute, so please just unmute your line. Thank you that you were able to connect in time. I want to ask you from your perspective, as you work in the global mobility space, how do we move the diversity question beyond race and ethnicity and gender? Because it does seem to me that in the work that you're doing, it's much more than that, right? You're still muted, Zanaib. Yeah, you're still on mute. There we go. No, you're still muted.
Let me try to do it this way.
Perfect. Yeah, we can hear you now. No, you've gone again.
Can you hear me now?
Now we've got you, yes.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I have some Wi-Fi connection issues since yesterday. So what I wanted to address actually from a global mobility perspective is that it's an effort that goes beyond global mobility, right? So diversity is not something that we can focus per HR category. We need to look at it as a whole. And most importantly, when hiring employees, and then, from a talent acquisition perspective, it runs and flows towards global mobility. I think it's a very close collaboration between talent acquisition and global mobility to ensure that diversity is taken into account when hiring. I think that's the first step we need to look into.
Chris, let me come to you and ask, where do you see that crossover between mobility and talent and retention as it relates to this question of diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, so I think as a training organization, I think what has been quite compelling for us over recent years, and having started very much in the cultural training arena and looking at the concept of culture from a national perspective, is that we're increasingly seeing much wider concepts of difference and diversity coming into the whole sort of cultural mix. So this idea of inherent diversity and acquired diversity is an important consideration for us in a training sense right now. And I think, our focus has always been very much on the general mindsets and skills. So what are the behaviors and skills associated with being culturally intelligent, and how does that apply increasingly in much more complex, diverse organizations? So it's not just about preparing people to work in different national situations or scenarios, It's about ensuring that people have the relevant skills to participate in diverse teams, etc., and be able to understand how to collaborate and how to extract the value. So I think the exciting part of diversity in the mix for us at the moment is very much in that crossover, if you like, between the kind of inherent and acquired diversity skills. And I think that's, where there's a lot of challenge, but a lot of opportunity to think about, how we address skills development, people development through the types of programs and tools that we use.
Zanaib, Beth, maybe just to come back to both of you on the mobility question, I was reading some research by KPMG from 18 months ago, and they were looking at diversity and inclusivity objectives, and they were saying that less than 50%, probably about 41% of the companies they worked with have specific diversity and inclusion objectives as part of their global mobility strategy. And when they were asked why that was the case, most of them said that international assignments were determined primarily by the business unit involved, and not really in consultation with people like you, I guess, in terms of global mobility. Any thoughts around that? How do we get that intersection right between talent and mobility and diversity? Zanaib, do you want to comment on that?
Yes, of course. I think what we need to do is take a few steps back and look at how and where are we determining who goes on assignment and why. So mostly what we traditionally have seen is that companies decide themselves, or business leaders decide themselves who they need, where they need somebody, and how long they need somebody. Once that decision is made, they then consult with either talent or global mobility. And I think in order to include diversity into that discussion, but also include global mobility and talent from the beginning, I think there are a lot of elements we need to consider, like technology, for example. Instead of the business deciding who needs to go where, we need to be able to make a selection and propose that to the business leaders to say, this is the skill set you're searching. Just the same as what we do with talent acquisition when they are going outside and looking for candidates, we need to do the same internally. Be able to propose a few options to the business leaders to say, this is a pool of individuals that you can select based on these skill set. Also blind to avoid, biases and those kind of stereotypes that you generally don't want to be part of that discussion. So I think there is a lot that still needs to be done. But I think a good support of a technology is the key in this, in order to be able to, with a big organization, to have one pool of data where you can actually make that blind selection.
Beth, I know that you've done some work in the inclusion space, and I want to reference the research that we started with at the beginning, which talks about sentiment. So McKinsey are saying that in many companies, there is growing positive sentiment towards the ideas of diversity, but that's not tracking with inclusion. What would you say inclusion needs to look like in this COVID world right now? And how is your organization embracing those principles of inclusion in what you're doing? Could you maybe just give us some examples of that?
Sure. Well, I think it's more important now than ever before. We have more employees around the world working from home indefinitely. And, what that means is, our managers or organizations, they need to go above and beyond to ensure that our employees feel connected to the organization and that we're meeting the unique needs of every individual. So whether that be for working parents and allowing flexible options and or just adjusted schedules, or ensuring that employees are not feeling burnt out and providing those additional resources to allow for employee well-being. So, it's definitely an interesting time. And I think we need to think, beyond the typical day and really understand and listen to what the needs are. So, yeah, certainly more important now than ever. I feel like in our organization, fortunately, we have a renewed commitment to inclusion. And it's refreshing to see. So hopefully more organizations are really on board with that, with their leadership.
Welcome, everybody. If you've just joined us, and again, if you have questions for the panel, please type those into chat, and we'll take those as they come. Question from Mike Burwald. Aren't soft skills in general undervalued in comparison with technical and business skills? And is that possibly not why HR has so little impact on who is sent on assignment? Let me throw that out to the panel. Anybody want to take that one?
Yeah, I think, yes, I completely agree with that. And that's why I also believe that in order to collect the technical and business skills of individuals, we also need to have the same, and we also need to collect the same for all the soft skills. So you can't just select people based on technical business hard skills. You need to include the soft skills in there. And I know there is some research done on, the difference between men and women, and women possessing more soft skills versus men possessing more business skills. And I don't agree with that at all. I think it's a combination, and depending on the role and depending on what you actually want to achieve when somebody is sent on assignment, you need to be very careful with the right selection of the amount of technical business skills and the amount of soft skills. It can't be either or. It's just a combination of both. Absolutely.
Yih-Teen, let me bring you in here. Both of us are working in the academic space as well as in the corporate space. Are we doing enough, do you think, to prepare young talent for this new world of work around diversity and inclusion, and giving them these skills that Mike references to make them more employable in this new world of inclusivity? What are your thoughts?
Right. I think that this is indeed a very, very profound question and reflection we all need to make, particularly for us, for business schools, and also maybe for managers in organizations. I might connect this back to Mike's original question, and also Zanaib's, your original comment. What I see is that basically in the business school setting, we often offer training programs, custom programs for organizations. And when we do that, what we notice is that more and more demand come to the field of soft skills. Definitely also in combination with some hard skills like AI, technology, definitely this is also in the trend. But lots of training goes to leadership, negotiation, team building, teamwork, etc., etc. I think that it means that some companies and managers, when they go to the senior level, little by little, they understand that those soft skills are important and they want people to be equipped with that. But what is challenging is how to combine, like Zanaib, you mentioned, the combination of the two. So this basically gives a very interesting challenge to all of us, including trainers, educators, business leaders, partners, HR as well, is that no one can no longer stay within their field, just like I'm an HR specialist. I'm just like a business leader. So we basically need to somehow being able to cross the boundary to understand the business in a more holistic way. But this is not the way that we are trained sometimes, or maybe the way the organization is functioned. So I think that in my view, this will be an important step for all of us to transform the way we approach our work, about our training, education, so that little by little we can move closer to overcome the situation as Mike mentioned here.
Thanks, Yih-Teen. Chris, I know we're going to talk later about measurement, but Dennis Nidringhouse is asking or commenting, I wonder if soft skills could be included in an overall score along with technical skills in a candidate's profile to avoid a minimization of soft skills. I know we'll get to it later, Chris, but do you want to respond to that one? Including soft skills in an overall competency profile score?
Yeah, I think the definition of competencies in relation to soft skills, and in particular the sort of cultural intelligence, borderless workplace environment, we have always worked really to defining sets of competencies and capabilities. There are some big caveats to using assessments in relation to cultural intelligence for obvious reasons. But I think as we move from sort of diversity to look at inclusion, and in particular look at the concept of inclusivity and behaviors with that. So we're looking at moving from hard skills into soft skills. I think that we're seeing that as a huge transition at the moment, because everybody needs soft skills to enable their hard skills and business acumen, technical ability to flourish, particularly in increasingly diverse and remote working environments. So we continue to look at the idea of competency definition and competency development, although that terminology is moving more towards skills and capabilities. But that is a big part, I think, and it's very useful when you're working with individuals and teams to provide a sense of specifics in terms of what we're looking for in terms of advancement. So I think that will increasingly come more and more to the front.
You can see that we're trying to take your questions in real time, so please keep them coming. We're going to segue now into theme 2, having explored something of the intersection between diversity and inclusion, cultural intelligence and mobility. I want us to get a little bit more practical now. And Beth, if we can come to you, what would you say are some of the specific organizational steps that we can take to prepare people in this new world of mobility and D&I? So what are you doing in your organization to get that right? Could you share with us?
Sure. Well, we're very focused on education. So, during the pandemic and really this year, we've put a lot of additional resources into educating all of our employees, both on cultural intelligence as well as on inclusive leadership and everyone's role in creating an inclusive environment. So that's certainly been more of a focus. And we're really taking steps to, again, listen to our employees and getting them involved in reviewing all of the processes that we have in the organization and determining where we have hidden biases. So that's certainly been a focus, and really trying to take that collective approach to listen and hear where we have needs for improvement.
Zanaib, I'm hearing Beth talk about this whole idea of trying to remove bias. It's not completely possible because we are human beings after all, but I know that when we chatted yesterday, you were sharing with some practical things that you're doing around recruitment, around even the targeting of particular groups or sets of people that you're working with specific skills, and even some apps that you're working on as an organization.
Yes.
Maybe just share those with us if you would.
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, from a recruitment perspective, we have done quite a lot of work in trying to eliminate as much bias as possible by introducing blind recruitment. So when a CV comes in, a lot of elements identifying a person to be, the age, the race, the picture, all of those identifiers are pretty much eliminated. And you can only see what a person has gained in terms of experience and their education. So basically, those are the two elements that are filtered out, just to be able to recruit purely on what you are looking for. At the same time, the recruitment initiatives have put a couple of soft skill criteria in place where they recommend to the hiring manager to focus on based on our organization, such as flexibility. So what kind of questions do you need to ask to be able to identify whether a person is flexible enough for our organization, or autonomy, for example, certain things that, they're really soft skill oriented, because the organization and the culture you need to fit in there to be able to do your job well. Although you can do it, that's not the problem. You need to be able to fit in as well. So I think there's a lot of talent acquisition initiatives at the same time because of those talent acquisition initiatives. So we have been hiring some individuals who have autism, for example, which was not really a deliberate choice, but they were just the right fit and the right person for that job. So they were just hired. And we did not make any selection of, their autism. They have autism, so we need to provide them with additional resources and probably additional space, to be able to focus themselves, because it does require some open-mindedness, I think, from organization, and also flexibility to cater those individuals as well. So not assuming that they can just come to the office and work from a shared desk environment. You need to provide them with single units where they can actually do their job without being distracted. So those kind of small initiatives have been put in place. And at the same time, it has resulted in great apps, such as an app that initially it wasn't supposed to work that way, but it did. So a lot of people with visual imperatives or hearing problems, they can use this app via either turning on the visuals in the app or turning on the voice in the app. Either way fits them. And they can make their selection of goods they want to purchase or selections they want to make based on their own personal preferences, right? So I think that has been a great initiative, I think, from a recruitment perspective, HR perspective, down to the line of really implementing a product at the end of the
Yih-Teen, I think about my own work in the field of cultural intelligence, and historically it was about preparing people to work with others from other countries or other nationalities and developing our cultural intelligence along those lines. It seems as if in the world and the journey towards inclusion, we need something different. I know you've been working on this notion of cultural bridging. Won't you share that with us as an insight into some practical steps that we might take in this regard?
Okay, thank you. Sure. So initially, I started working on cultural bridging concept coming from a national cultural differences perspective, right? Basically, as Chris mentioned earlier, conventionally, the kind of cross-cultural training focuses more on knowledge acquisition. Basically, we document how culture can be different, how Japanese people will behave, what are their cultural norms, and how Germans are different from other cultures. So we started to create this kind of knowledge list, and we would be able to somehow expect people know the knowledge and they know how to do when we interact with those cultures. But little by little, we realize that this is not the case. So somehow we can know a lot about their culture, but when we still have two groups of people from two different cultures coming to work together, we still don't know how to handle the situation, because who should adapt to whom? To which extent? So there are quite a few practical questions that we have no answer. So basically, the effort about cultural bridging framework is that I would like to propose this another maybe next step of knowledge development to propose action-oriented answer to that question. Once we know that there are differences, what can we do? So the underlying principle of cultural bridging is not only to know about the differences, but to understand how can we work with each other. And the underlying principle is connection. How can we build connection? And then practically, as Andy, you mentioned, there are three specific areas what we would be focusing on. The first one is to build cognitive connection. Cognitive connection, meaning that how can we facilitate mutual understanding? Definitely, we need some knowledge to be able to connect. So we need to know each other's background, history, norms, etc. So basically, cognitively, how can we facilitate that? The second part is on the emotional side. So it's not only like cognitively we know that we are different, but how can we build a kind of more positive feeling? We feel positive toward each other instead like, we know that we're different, but I hate that. So can we build this kind of positive feeling, and even to extend that we can create a kind of common sense of belonging. We can create a common sense of identity. We belong to this work group. We belong to this organization, despite our differences. And the third dimension is on the behavior side, basically the behavior connection, meaning that we know we are different, but then now we need to work together. I think there's some practical things that based on the understanding we have, based on this kind of mutual acceptance on emotional side, can we agree on something? how can we behave? How do we organize our action? So basically, this would be something that in the cultural bridging framework, also a leader, a manager would need to somehow articulate very carefully. And this will allow sometimes we can still be ourselves. We can still be authentic, but because others understand how we are, how we behave. So there would be less misunderstanding, and we can be collaborating and prosper together while being authentic to ourselves.
Thank you for all your questions. I want to just pause and acknowledge Victor and Russell, Alyssa-san and Valentina. They've really posed some phenomenal questions here. I'm going to combine Victor and Russell's questions and direct it to the panel. What actions are taken by your organizations when a candidate does not accept a job due to not feeling that the D&I culture is correct? And then the segue to that is Russell's question. Isn't it a fine line between choosing candidates on the basis of cultural fit and the danger of cloning? Some research has said that in truly inclusive cultures, we should be comfortable with misfits, quote unquote, for better innovation. So let's stop there and see if we can address those. Beth, I see you're nodding.
Sure. So I can speak to both in some way. So, one of the things that we're trying to do is give candidates a true sense of what it's like in our organization and introduce them to what we call inclusion communities, which many of organizations call employee resource groups, and really make sure so we're in the process of doing this, but making sure that they have a presence externally so that candidates can really get a feel for what it's like, doing video clips where our candidates can hear directly from our real employees, not actors, to hear what is it like to work in the organization. We really try to spotlight and highlight our employees, careers and what they love about working there so that they can get a good fit for it. So I think if we were to have a decline, we would still try to share some of that information with them. And hopefully, they're able to maybe next time around or spread the word that, we do have, some great, inclusion and diversity initiatives. And in terms of the second piece, I think that it's very true. I mean, we certainly want to hire candidates that are different from us because, that is the way that we're going to get to the true innovative, ideas. And so we also use those inclusion communities to help us through social media and other channels attract, diverse talent.
Great. Zanaib, anything you want to add to that?
I actually wanted to add one element into this, and I think that a candidate not accepting a job based on the D&I culture is, I think it's a wake-up call, but also a learning. I think D&I is an initiative that is evolving. It's not something that you can just write on the paper and then be done with it. It's an evolving process, and I think organizations are learning from the good initiatives that have been implemented, but also the bad ones. It's just a learning process. And I think if you are okay to make mistakes along the line, then it's going to make you a better, I think in the long run, a better organization and a more psychologically safer organization. And maybe that same candidate can come back and say, yes, now I feel more comfortable. And that's just the way it is in life, right? So just wanted to add that as well. I think it's just a learning phase.
Mm-hmm.
Please keep your questions coming. Go ahead, Yih-Teen. Yep.
Yeah, sorry. Can I also jump in to somehow follow up what Beth and Zanaib has said? Particularly, I would like to go to the question Russell asked about the cultural fit. Right? Basically, I think this is a really interesting question. And sometimes I think recently this kind of discussion might give the name cultural fit, put cultural fit into a bad name. I probably will want to somehow correct this a little bit. I think that what is maybe interesting and useful is to be very clear about our usage of culture. So how do we describe and define the culture? I think that the risk of cloning everyone, cloning ourselves, will happen if we talk about cultural fit at the very surface level. Basically, the kind of race or gender or this kind of things that we have. But if we talk about the more profound and deep level culture, then that kind of cultural fit could be quite important. Let me give you an example. Think about maybe the company Netflix. Netflix is also a very famous company. We talk about the culture. Basically, the two principles is responsibility and freedom, right? Do we want to have people valuing this? And do we want to hire people fitting into this culture? I would say yes, this kind of cultural fit is very important. But how to reach being responsible and having freedom can have different ways, different pace. We can come from different gender, different ethnic background, and we can fulfill that in our own way. So I think that the kind of diversity can happen in the way to approach the fundamental values, but the fundamental values that we cherish in the company, like responsibility and freedom, as an example, should be there. So cultural fit is important, but be very careful about how we define that. So we would not misuse it and then let it become like a obstacle to D&I.
Thank you. We're going to segue into the leadership theme now. Keep the questions coming. Reinhold, I see yours. And I want to come back now to Olusesan and Valentina and try and weave these into the leadership questions. So Valentina says, in a growing digital economy, hiring remote international talent is becoming a new normal as well as a necessity. How do we ensure the inclusion of this talent into organizations, and what types of skills leaders and managers need to develop to ensure team cohesion and collaboration? And then let me merge that with Olusesan Ayeni's question, where it talks about flexibility. How do organizations manage and adapt diversity, culture, and inclusion in a blended workforce, remote, working from home, on-site employees, contract and part-time employees? So two difficult questions there. I don't know who wants to take either or both of those.
I better have a go, Andy, on that.
Chris?
Yep. So certainly, I think some of the trends that we're seeing at the moment where organizations were kind of in this sort of VUCA state, and now in the post-COVID world are entering a sort of super VUCA state. We are seeing, I think, accelerated transformation within many organizations. Increasing team-based structures and increasingly diverse groups coming together remotely as well. So that throws together quite a mix of requirements in terms of how do you bring diverse groups together, how do you extract the value from those diverse teams working together, and how do you throw in the mix there of working remotely. And I think that puts a little bit of pressure on some of the leadership elements and the leadership capabilities as well. But I think increasingly the ability for teams to translate and work effectively in a remote environment, and to not lose sight of the fact that they have inherent diversity within those groups is certainly important. And I think that's one of the bigger challenges at the moment within organizations as they try and sort of struggle in this kind of increasingly remote environment. I think that's going to be a trend that will continue for some while.
Do you want to just talk to the CIPD survey, Chris, and maybe just help us to understand what that was looking at around frontline managers and their power to implement change?
Yeah, I mean, the CIPD was looking at a number of different issues, particularly around how well organizations and teams were incorporating diversity. I think one of the strongest themes that came through on that was the issue of, really the people that are being looked at as role models more and more in organizations are frontline managers, and that these people have the power to implement change or even undermine D&I initiatives. So I think the CIPD survey in particular looked very much at that audience group and thinking about defining the skills and capabilities that they're going to need. I think one of the things that came out very strongly in the survey also was the need to give voice to employees more and more, particularly in a remote environment. And that, there was evidence in the report was saying that the more autonomy and the more voice that is given, the more employees will feel trusted and treated fairly and so on. So I think there were some strong points in that, and it's one of a recent raft of surveys that have come out, and I can share links to that.
Great. Now, we are talking about the inclusion imperative, and great to have you all with us. And thank you again for your questions and comments. From Reinhold Titus, Reinhold says, is there a danger of, quote, over-inclusion for an organization? And if so, what could it be? Zanaib?
That's a good one. Over-inclusion. I could not think of over-inclusion. I mean, you can definitely focus on over-diversity, I think. If you look, for example, what we have seen in the past couple of years is a trend of increasing women within the organization, and I understand where the underlying problem is. But what we are doing now is positive discrimination, right? It's more about you want to include more women in an organization, so you focus only on that specific area where you neglect other areas where you should also focus your attention to. So I think in terms of diversity, I can think of a few, but inclusion, I don't know. Professor, can you maybe add something in? This one is tough.
Yes, this is an interesting one and very maybe challenging one. I guess maybe from maybe influenced by my Asian culture background, I like to see the duality. I think that when we talk about diversity, maybe we can also see that from a diverse that duality way. Basically, it's about others. It's also about ourselves. And then when we talk about inclusion, when we include others, I think that maybe the kind of duality side of that could be, maybe when people might feel that their authenticity might be threatened by such kind of initiatives. So when we want to really embrace everyone's value, everyone's point of view, or all the differences, we want to be so inclusive, can we still stand firm on our own values, on our own belief, what we think is right? Can we still hold those standards? Can we still hold this kind of criteria, right? I guess that this might be the risk that I will see that. So does it mean that diversity and inclusion means everything goes? We just have to accept everyone? Or how do we draw the line? I guess this might be the challenge that we all need to confront. And this basically the kind of the two sides. We probably are moving from maybe not enough inclusive to too much inclusive. And I think that to be in the society now, I think we also start to feel that people need to be so politically correct. This might already show some indication about maybe the risk of over-inclusion. And then I guess that how can we also train all the people to be at the same time being open, being inclusive, but also know how to affirm one's own belief and value. That's an interesting and very subtle task that we need to confront.
So again, we don't want to keep this just at a conceptual level because we want to be as practical as possible. But Kathleen Curran asks a very pertinent question, which I'm going to address to the panel. And Kathleen says, much discussion about diversity and inclusion is conceptual. A missing piece between the two is equity. Equitable access enables the conditions needed. How do you address the question of equitable access, panel? I think we've stumped them, Kathleen.
That's not on my list of questions.
No, it wasn't on mine either, but I think it's brilliant. We'll come back to that one if we need to.
We need to take time for that one. Yeah.
But while you're thinking about that, let me just add another layer of complexity. Dennis Nidringhaus is commenting on the choice of the vice president for the Democratic Party, which was announced yesterday. Any thoughts? Not getting you to make a political statement, but the comment or the comment here is that it's interesting to observe the overall reaction from people as to Joe Biden's choice. Anybody want to talk to that?
Beth, I think you're the closest there.
Yeah,
I think there does seem to be some history in the making about it, Beth, politics aside.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, I haven't seen all of the commentary around it, but, I think working up to, I mean, I'm very excited to have a woman actually person of color be nominated. So I think it's definitely history in the making for us.
Great. Let me post another one to you while we're thinking about this. It does seem that when we look at the questions of diversity and inclusion and mobility and talent, that the leadership question, the sentiments around that is tracking more to the negative. And it does seem to underscore the need for companies to engage their business managers more effectively in this question of diversity and inclusion. Chris, any thoughts on that in terms of how we cascade this through the organization? How do we get leaders and managers to understand that they need to take responsibility for providing the momentum to this inclusion imperative?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of cultural initiatives, cultural intelligence initiatives that are working from both top to bottom and bottom up in organizations. I think ensuring that leaders have a sense of ownership, there's a degree of responsibility and evidence that they're walking the talk, I think is always crucially important. I think we're seeing a strong part of that. I think the leadership element within generally in terms of how organizations are approaching team development is significant. I think there's much more of a focus around team development at the moment, particularly from a D&I perspective. And I think that's probably one of the the biggest trends that we're seeing at the moment. So I think, and that's really driven also by some of the strategy elements as well. So as organizations link diversity and inclusion to innovation and transformation, they're very much looking to place that in a sort of business case scenario and to express that in terms of how teams perform.
Let's segue now into our fourth and final theme, which is the whole question of developing cultural intelligence, CI, and measuring cultural quotient, CQ. Beth, what are you seeing in terms of cultural intelligence training and development in your organization? How do we get that to address some of these questions in terms of diversity and inclusion? What still needs to change, would you say?
We're very new in our journey with cultural intelligence. We really just introduced it to the organization this year. And that really stemmed from, again, hearing the needs of our global population. Being headquartered in the US, we were often receiving feedback from our global employees that we were very, US centric, and that so we knew we needed to address it. We know it's a need. And so, offering cultural intelligence education, to our colleagues has been very valuable. And it's just being able to help our teams, our global teams, be more productive, to understand each other's needs, to come to the team and the table, with a just a better appreciation and understanding for their colleagues around the world. And so I think it's in generally going to make us more productive and more effective and more cohesive as an organization.
Zanaib, I know you've been working with the whole concept of ambassadors.
Yes. So that is quite interesting. I think what we have done is that the diversity and inclusion topic is not one person's responsibility or one team's responsibility, is an organization's responsibility. So what we have done is we have created many ambassadors within the organization. It's not only senior leaders, it can be employees, mid managers, senior managers, leaders. Everyone basically can become an ambassador if you have a passion for it, and that's what we have done. And at the same time, we provide a lot of education, a lot of content, a lot of education. It's still a choice for the employees to go and educate themselves on diversity and inclusion, but we have also started to make some of those courses mandatory, just to make sure that everyone completes that and gets a sense of what we are headed towards. what I also wanted to add in terms of the leadership topic just a few minutes ago is that it's not only about the higher leadership being a role model. They also need, and to your point, Chris, walk the talk. And I think it all comes down to self-reflection. I think what I've seen in the past with many, many leaders in the organization, they had self-reflection. They were very, very good at, pointing out what they were doing well and not so well, but they were really, really bad at self-correction. And I think those two are crucial in being able to learn from your mistakes, but also correct yourself to not make the same judgment in the future. And that is essential to the leadership topic, definitely.
Yih-Teen, I know you've been doing some work on how diversity often creates disconnection. You've been working with this cultural model, and you've also been looking at how multicultural teams impact on status differences. Just talk a little bit about your empirical research and the whole question of cultural identity as it relates to this question of cultural intelligence and the cultural quotient, if you would.
Thank you. So basically, let me briefly share this. So I think that there are already quite a few scientific research demonstrating the kind of antecedent or predictors of cultural intelligence. I think that Beth and Zanaib, you shared already something that you can do by leadership, by training, by different kind of approaches, or just increasing international experiences. Definitely, they are all helping. But maybe going back to Zanaib, your last comment about self-reflection, I like to bring this idea into ourselves. That is, we also, in the publication, in a paper we published in 2018, basically we discovered that one interesting predictor of cultural intelligence in a multicultural setting is a person's cultural identities. So how do we define ourselves? How do we see ourselves? Somehow, this kind of self-conception have very profound impact on how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. And then basically, if you think that you are a pure American, if you are a pure Chinese, you are pure Japanese, or you are a mixed or bicultural, or you are a marginal, or you don't know who you are. So all this kind of definition will give you very different drive in how you approach other culture, approach yourselves. So basically, in our research is that maybe the thing that I would like to recommend everyone to avoid is to be careful not to define ourselves in a very strict, rigid, one single cultural box. If you put yourself into one single cultural box and strongly just identify and embrace that culture, that identity, it would be quite risky that we might be somehow locked inside the box. When you can have a second box, can you have a multiple box, or you say that I don't want to be in any box at all, or even you want to add a global level, so basically a different kind of combination or configuration of identities, then things can open up. So basically, to answer your question in a more brief way, is that cultural identity and our self-conception about how we define ourselves can be quite critical. And I would say that this might apply beyond national culture. In a very general way, our self-identity, our self-concept might also be a factor that might enable an individual, anyone like us, to maybe find a better way to approach diversity and inclusion. And this basically, I want to echo what Zanaib, you mentioned about the importance of self-reflection.
Chris, how do we track this ability to develop cultural intelligence on the one hand and measure this notion of cultural quotient on the other?
Yeah, so I think the approach that Yih-Teen just outlined, and actually earlier in relation to the culture bridging concept, goes really to the heart and to the core of how we're seeing the development of cultural training in many respects, and the traditional form of providing country-based information, national-based cultural profiling, and so forth, is definitely sort of evolving and has evolved over a number of years. We're seeing very much the focus of learning starting with self. So this idea that one develops more of a sort of deeper understanding of one's own particular sort of cultural orientations across a spectrum, and develops the skills, the adaptive skills associated with that, to be able to identify differences in the kind of unique scenarios and everyday work scenarios that they take place in. And that's really the fundamental transition, I think. And I think that's a fundamental definition. for us around cultural intelligence, it's what we summarize as read and respond. Can you read a particular cultural situation, and can you respond appropriately to that situation? Do you have the relevant awareness, knowledge, and skills to be able to adapt to that situation? The issue of measurement is an interesting one, and it's one that we've looked at hard, and it's one that we've incorporated very much in the sense of our learning process, and particularly as a lot of our sort of learning content tools and assessments are in an online form. So we're looking at some of the technologies, the learning experience platform technologies and so forth, that can help to create a much richer learning experience where there is kind of measurements and metrics that are built into that at an individual level. But the sorts of things learners want to know is, where am I in my learning journey? I've got limited time. What do I need to focus on? How can I share experiences with others? And there are various tools and elements that we're bringing in that have an element of measurement and feedback and data analysis for the learner and for teams and for organizations. I would just mention there are, and historically have been, a number of assessment tools that claim to measure CQ, but I think the issue of CQ, unlike IQ, is that there's not one empirical or standardized measure of what CQ is at the moment, and it's a rich and evolving field.
Thank you. Yih-Teen, I'm going to just pose a comment to you from Art Bingham, who says, while this certainly doesn't completely solve the problem of access, especially globally, one tactic to improve the access that Kathleen was referring to might be to expand the span of universities targeted by a company's talent acquisition team. For example, in the US, we shouldn't be limiting recruiting just to the Ivy League or the Big Ten universities, and expand to include universities that are serving different economic levels. Your thoughts in 20 seconds, Yih-Teen?
I think that we are seeing this happening, right? Basically, now with this, all this kind of online teaching, online learning, and also like the free courses from MIT, from Coursera, etc. I think that this is a trend. We haven't reached there yet, but I'm hoping that this will somehow address the access issue that you mentioned. Thank you.
Right, we've got about 2 minutes. So Beth, in 20 seconds, where to from here?
Well, I just think, 20 seconds. Keep doing what we're doing, focus on education, and get everyone involved in the organization.
Zanaib?
I want to say, indeed, to Beth's point, keep learning, keep having the same self-reflection, keep traveling. I know COVID is here, but as soon as that's over, we should definitely travel and explore new cultures and enrich our experiences. I think that's really, really important as an individual.
Yih-Teen?
Okay, maybe one word is remember the duality, the two sides. At the same time, think about others, but also reflect on self. And also when we want to embrace differences, also maybe think about how do we still can find a way to remain authentic and truthful to our values.
Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think just to pick up on Yih-Teen's point, I think authenticity is a fundamental for sure in terms of capabilities, a focus on learning. We're a training organisation. I would just like to mention a recent book that I've started to read, which I think is to the point of a lot of the questions here, and particularly Russell's earlier question around misfits. And it's a book called Rebel Ideas. And we can put it into the link. It's by a journalist, Sunday Times journalist, and it really addresses the whole issue of diverse thinking in teams and the power of diverse thinking in teams. And I think it goes to the heart of a lot of the issues around inclusivity and some of the points we've been talking about.
From the West Coast, Beth, thank you so much. Right across to Taiwan, Yih-Teen. In between Zanaib and Chris, and to all of you, thank you for making today's conversation rich and informative and inclusive. And we really trust that you have found it beneficial. Until next time, from me, Andy Brough, and the rest of the team, thank you for joining us today for the Inclusion Imperative. Bye-bye.